Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 493rd New Social Environment. I'm Cal, the curatorial assistant here at the Rail. I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on Carl Andre, featuring Douglas Dreishpoon and Alistair Rider with Phong H. Bui. We are thrilled to welcome the poet Ari Lisner here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded lands and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Art historian, curator, and critic Douglas Dreishpoon is currently director of the Catalogue Raisonné project at the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation in New York City and chief curator emeritus at the Albright-Knox Gallery in Buffalo. His anthology of sculptors' writings, Modern Sculpture, Artists in Their Own Words, is forthcoming this fall. Art historian Alistair Rider is senior lecturer in the School of Art History at the University of St. Andrews. He writes about European and North American art from the 1950s to the present day and has a special interest in abstraction, particularly minimal art. He is the author of Carl Andre, Things in Their Elements. And I now hand the mic over to our publisher, Phong H. Bui. Phong, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Doug, for being here with us. Thank you, Alistair, being part of this also. You know, I've been thinking because of what we've been going through in the last 2 years, particularly since the pandemic arrived so unexpectedly. But I've been thinking about Alexis de Tocqueville's concept of self-interest understood that mediates the 50% that belongs to the tyranny of minority, with references to the old European monarchies, and the 50% that belongs to the tyranny of majority, which favors a newfound America. I can't help but to also think what he also say in his book, Democracy in America. There are men of principle in both parties in America, but there is no party of principle. Inevitably, this brings up, in a way, the Alistair, Isaiah Berlin's famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, which essentially proposes the fundamental differences between negative liberty and positive liberty, you know, one being free from something, that's the key word, being free from something, and the other being free to be able to do something. So that's a two operative word, from and to. In other words, the former declaratively say, I'm no slave, while the other say, I am my own master. My apologies for sounding so philosophical, but we should occasionally be reminded that the very word philosophy means to love wisdom. Yes, it's a study of, if you like, knowledge, not information, mind you, and the meaning of life, and so on. What I'm saying, why I'm saying all this thing, I'm not so sure, except that Kant's, Immanuel Kant's complex idea of paternalism, which can swing either way, coercion or persuasion, has been on my mind a lot lately. What I'm trying to say is, having gone through many shows in Chelsea last week with Kyle, my assistant here, I think we all were so fatigued, largely by objects that were made intentionally or unintentionally, made to beg for your attention so loudly. So having witnessed the brilliant, you know, in a way, of our past president, masterful deployment of speed as means of amplify distraction, to breed chaos, to intensify anxiety, and so on and so forth among us, it was a relief indeed to come into Paula Cooper Gallery on 21st Street. We were immediately reminded that love wisdom is to ask always the most fundamental questions. not far off, not too far on and off, convoluted question, especially in regarding to the word theory, which also means both condition of speculation and contemplation, not one without the other. This, of course, brings to my very first question. I remember talking to Barbara, asking Barbara Rose about her good friend, who also a great friend of Carl Andre, Hollis Frampton, the great filmmaker, in regarding to his trail dialogues with Carl that was, I think, recorded between 1962 and 63. So it's really 1 year, edited and annotated by Benjamin Buchloh, that was published by the press of Nova Scotia College of Art and an NYU press. I think it was New York University Press in 1980, where Barbara had asked Frampton, as I was talking to Alistair and Doug yesterday, whether he had read John Graham's influential book, 1937, System and Dialectics of Art. Barbara said to me that he gave Frampton the book, mostly because Graham asked fundamental questions too, such as what is abstraction, what is form, what is subject matter, what is the relationship between art and technique, what is American art, etc., etc. Frampton, in other words, was so interested in the concept of the book, as he was at the same time was interested what was going on in the avant-garde community, film community, the circles of filmmakers surrounding Jonas Makers, Michael Snow, Stan Brakhage, among others, who also wrote. As you guys remember, there was a community surrounding Film Culture magazine, which Frampton frequently contributed. And I should mention Filmmaker Cooperative and Filmmaker Cinematheque, which grew into later anthology film archives. So my first question is to both of you. Maybe we should ask Alistair to respond first, and then you, Doug. What do you think of this remarkable trail dialogues that they did together for that 1 year between Frampton and Carr?
Well, it is an amazing publication, isn't it? I would have loved to have seen all of the dialogues. I mean, we've only got 12, which they identified, but I guess many more were produced. They were, I think they happened as a sort of activity on Sunday nights between Hollis Frampton and Carl Andre. They would sit at Rosemary Castoro's typewriter in Carl Andre's small apartment in Brooklyn, and they would take turns typing out these responses to one another. And there was an activity that they did in the background, and Carl couldn't remember what it was, but he definitely thought that they were doing something in a structured way in the background when I spoke to him a few years ago about it.
Yeah.
But they are an amazing, it's a great publication if you haven't seen it already. And I learned so much from it. And what is so amazing about it is you do see this new aesthetic emerging, this new sensibility, which stays with Andre throughout his life. I mean, it's obviously a very formative moment. And what's wonderful is you see them thinking about different art media, and just honing their perspectives about their respective interests, and then identifying clear positions on those perspectives. Yeah. Doug, do you want to come in?
So here's the Graham book.
Oh, yeah, the original.
Yeah, I was able to find a copy many years ago, and it's not surprising that Frampton Frampton would be interested in Graham, the book is basically all questions.
Mhm.
And most of the propositions begin with what, and then they end in a question mark. And I love that. So whatever the system is, it's a system of inquiry and a system that is designed, and folks should know, and it's been reprinted, so one can get it. Johns Hopkins Press reprinted it not that long ago. Almost every artist, if they could get their hands on a copy, had a copy of Graham. And Graham was this white Russian, rather mysterious character that in some miraculous way became a conduit for all of the questions that were being raised in the art world at that time, that were historical, contemporary, political, social, artistic. So he's asking amazing questions. Frampton, of course, along with Andre, would look at those questions and think them incredibly germane, even though the book was published in 1936. The dialogues, to me, and Alistair, I think you're spot on, the dialogues are about two 20-something-year-olds having conversations around things that are of interest to them. The important thing to recognize is that a lot of the views are inchoate. I mean, at that point in their lives, they're looking at everything, they're thinking about everything. It's the early 60s. And so art is in a very interesting place. In fact, it's in a place that one could say had a wide open portal to it, you know, and that there were many things on the aesthetic table that were being considered. One of my favorite dialogues is their trip to Philadelphia to see Duchamp and Brancusi and Rodin at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And their views around all of them are incredibly interesting in terms of what sticks through time and what's rejected through time and what's critiqued through time. So it's something that we can come back to, because the Duchamp part of that conversation I find very interesting. And by the 70s, particularly Andre is anti-Duchamp. I mean, he's completely turned. And so this notion of contradiction is something that we should talk about as well as we kind of move along. But it's a great document and a really great place to start.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, just for those you don't remember Graham's real name, he's basically born in Kiev. Real name is Ivan Dabrowski. So I think he has served in the Tsar Army as a cavalry officer, came to New York 1920 and whatnot, and ended up later married to Elena Sonnenbaum's mother. So that's Leo Castelli, kind of father-in-law. It's very strange. He died in 1961, I think. I knew all this because John, our dear friend, the late great painter, Ron Warchuk, was very close to Graham. But in any rate, this is the book, you guys, that Alistair was referring to. And yes, so the trip that you are referring to on the journey to Philadelphia and very important to always end with consecutive matters. You remember that? So everything end with conservative matters on literature and conservative matter on movie and on photograph and so on and so forth. So I like to also follow up, because to me, when you mentioned Frampton, the significant work too, in a way, Doug, is later in 1970, the Yon Lima. I mean, he made all the films before that, but the reason why I'd like to also start with that film, because I seen an anthology film archive. There was a retrospective in late 90s, and I have seen it since I'm also now on the board of anthology. The film is made in 3 different sections, very interesting. The first is reading, can't remember who read it, but the reading was of Bay State Primer, a Puritan work for children to learn the alphabet. And the second is based on a textbook by Carl, which started out with a list of alphabet, or an alphabetical list of words for each letter in the alphabet. each subsequent list is played with a letter, I think, until it is just letter. You know, some of us see the film, and I remember talking to Jonas, as 3 stages of life in a way, you know, the morality of Bay State primer being childhood, the set of numbers representing maturing or the way that one can interact with the world. And the third part is representing old age and death. That's more or less. Why I'm bringing this up, because it's fantastic. It's amazing how Barbara essay, ABC Art, was published even 5 years before, you know? So that's what I just wanted to lay out the context. So I just want to ask whether you, how do you solve, you know, structuralist cinema, and then how the whole world was cross-pollinate at the time, being a filmmaker, being a poet, being a sculptor, being a painter, seemed to have this amazing, you know, exchange in perpetual dialogue. Alistair?
Yes, well, absolutely. I think, Phong, you're absolutely right there. When you start looking at that moment in the early 1960s in terms of all the filmic and literary references, you realize what a sort of rich intellectual arena we have at this moment. And it's out of that complex series of conversations and discussions that minimalism arises. If you start looking at the kind of roots of minimalism, then you end up with a very impure phenomenon that's far more sophisticated and surprising and unexpected in terms of its references than you might get the impression from just looking at the completed works. But yeah, no, I fully agree with you there. It's a really exciting moment.
Doug, what do you remember when you first read Barbara ABC Art that was published in Art America?
The most notable thing for me was that Barbara was not out to codify, but to open and to basically lay out. And you know, as a critic, and we have to say this about Barbara Rose, as a critic, she was incredibly artist-centric. So it wasn't about spinning theories about art. It was about going to the studios and about talking to artists in order to figure out, or at least in her own mind, sort out what was happening in each of those creative spaces at the time. And so ABC Art, it's not a codification of anything other than kind of laying out in some journalistic semantics what was happening, which is what makes it so amazing to this day and a great piece to go back to. So she's citing everybody, including Duchamp, including Ad Reinhardt, you know, including Russian constructivist art.
That's right.
The other thing that I would say, and this is vis-a-vis Barbara, is there ends up being this kind of interesting tension between the words of artists and the words of critics. And what gets really interesting is that artists decide, and Andre was one of them, but he's more of a poet. So we have to keep that in mind in terms of how he writes and how he constructs language. It's not as much prose as it is poetic structure, that the artists want to tell their own story and they want to take it back. And so folks like Greenberg and Rosenberg had always been, you know, the kind of critical portals. And with Art Forum, it was Michael Fried and company. Yeah. There's this tension that is happening, and Andre is part of this circle of artists, including Bachner, including Smithson, including Saul LeWitt, who decide that they know better what they're about, which makes perfect sense to me.
And it's still remarkable thinking that that essay was written 65. That's early. That's even before Art Forum arrival to New York, which is 67, when you refer about Solo Witt, famous, essay, or Robert Morris, Notes on Sculpture.
Notes and paragraphs. Yeah.
Exactly. So I just want to clarify a little bit. You're absolutely right. It's not about definitively pigeonhole any tendency what was going on, but rather than somewhat laying a potential groundwork in a way in terms of reductive art or object sculpture. I think it's very important to know that all of that have very diverse roots, as you pointed out, Malevich on one hand and Duchamp the other. But they're also, the Alistair, we shouldn't forget about Wittgenstein's role in it, the writing of Ralph Grier and as much as the choreography of Merz-Cunningham. I think that's very interesting. But I know that she's sort of trying to put a certain artist in terms of their temperament, I know that.
That's exactly right. It's I confess it's been a few years since I've read this essay, and so I'm trying to rack my brains about just trying to recall it. But I do think that she's after in that essay a temperament, as you say, and she's one of the first people, I think, to register that there's some sort of aesthetic sensibility going on here. Leo Steinberg was picking up on that too in the early 60s. And that kind of got dropped from the conversation as minimalism developed. But I think it remains a really exciting and fascinating issue that there is a sort of a new sensibility arising in New York in this moment, which manifests itself in lots of different ways. And the people who are interested in it are reading the same kind of publications, the same kind of philosophers. And a critic like Barbara Rose, who's completely familiar and friendly with all of the artists, is piecing together and synthesizing this. But in a way, it's sort of the range and diversity and untidiness of that essay was quickly sort of tidied up and sharpened as minimalism became a kind of phenomenon. And by 1968, I think that sort of messiness is sort of eradicated to an extent.
Right, it's so true. What about the significance of Art Reinhardt, who writings that she put it together in that important volume, Art as Art. I think that was published by Viking Press. I wrote down here in 1975.
That's right.
Oh, you have it all. Okay, Doug.
I wasn't sure if you were going to mention it, but yeah.
No, I mean, it's an important figure. You go ahead, Doug.
So my sense of what Ad represented to the artists was a kind of contrarian personality of Zen-like, consciousness, the ability to see both sides, the ability to see the art world as a complicated ball of wax, but from a philosophical perspective, so he could call things out, and he did that brilliantly, and sometimes made enemies in the process. And also an artist who wrote like an angel. So Ad really, and he's not one of the first artists to write, but he was an artist at that moment who wrote prolifically and brilliantly, and also his drawings and satirical drawings and cartoons were a marvel to look at, and encapsulated the art world in ways that no one had really done up until that point, So the artists, I mean, Saul and Robert Morris and Judd, they could look to Ad and say, we can do that too. He gave them permission to talk about themselves and their art.
Alistair?
I think Reinhardt is a very formative figure for these younger artists, or a particular type of younger artist. He was very present at the Dwan Show 10, which collected together, 10 important young artists. He was one of the senior figures in that exhibition. And that was in, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 67, is that right? I think it's 67. But so that was sort of right at the end of his life. He died that summer. But there was something else which I think I want to emphasize about Reinhardt. He kind of legitimated the idea that you could make one type of art without variation, and you could persist with just making this one type of art. Because by that point, he'd spent about 7 years doing black paintings, and he rejoiced in their similarity. I mean, actually, when you look at them for real, there's a fair bit of variation among them. Mm-hmm. But when he writes about them and when he makes pronouncements about them, he's emphasizing not their difference, but their consistency. And I think that was pretty influential for this younger group of artists.
Yeah, I just want to mention that Reinhardt's relationship with Chinese poetry and Chinese philosophy was through his classmate at Columbia, Thomas Merton. So it had a significant influence in the work that he made from that relationship onwards. And I just want to show you that, in fact, here is one of the, can you guys see it okay?
Yeah.
Doug talk about the penmanship. This is one of the original postcard that he often wrote to his professor at Columbia.
My Shapiro, other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there
that's right.
Yeah, the penmanship is incredible, and the integrity of the calligraphy is something that he just maintained throughout his life. And I don't know whether he used a quill pen. Do we know, Phong, what
Yes,
it was?
he used the quill pen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I only showed that to everyone because I think it bears some incredible resemblance to the way that Carl wrote his poetry, not in terms of penmanship, but the clarity of precision of what word was to be written out. And so it brings me, right next to the question, because I thought about also Carl's relationship to dance. I think that's important to bring up a little bit because we haven't really gotten to talk about Merce Cunningham, particularly with Yvonne Rainer. And I know that he gave her many of his styrofoam sculpture for her performance. So the choreography of space is essentially, to me, is so important. So I wonder if you guys can just relate to some of that idea, space, dance, movement, space. Were there any of that that been touched on in your book, Alistair?
Yes, I got quite excited when I discovered that Carl Andre had participated in one of Yvonne Rainer's dances. That felt very cool to me. And this was a dance performance piece, which was part of 9 Evenings, the Art and Technology Festival. And for this performance, there were a number of non-professional dancers who stood on a grid. Mm-hmm. And were given instructions via walkie-talkie by Yvonne Rainer from above, and they had to move items around. And there was a list of items. And in fact, one of the items that was involved in it were some styrofoam blocks, which had been part of a sculpture of Andre's from 1965, Coin, Crib, and Compound, which were big kind of lumps of styrofoam, which were at a Thibaut Denage show. And so these just became props, and various people lifted them up and moved them around. And I mean, the way in which Yvonne Rainer has subsequently spoken about that piece implies that it, for her, wasn't very successful. It wasn't her best achievement. A lot of technical issues clouded the event. But nonetheless, it offered me an opportunity to think about the mobility, which is implicit in all of André's sculptures. You know, I mean, why do all these sculptures have to be taken apart and put back together when you reassemble them? And why do they have to be made of separate units? They could potentially be all very large things. But there's something very, very important about piecing down one module adjacent to another, bringing two modules together, laying them down. That action, that process, that activity is really critical. And it's impossible to think of André as a sculpture without understanding that. And yet, inherent in that, or axiomatic in that, is the idea that things move around. That we live in a world where everything is mobile. And this Yvonne Rainer choreography piece is just a reminder how liftable and portable André's sculptures are.
Yeah, now it seemed to be the right time to go back to that show that you referred to. Well, we don't have the slide of the first show, but we do have the slide of his second show, Thibaut. Can we go to the slide ASAP, Carl? It's so memorable for some of us who did not see the show there, but we have a document here from Paula Cooper sent the other day. So this is the show, the second show, I think, with Slash Show 2. How significant was this show at the time to Carl's own formation as an artist, and how were the artists and the public respond to the show, Alistair?
Well, I think this is the defining exhibition, really. This is where it all begins and comes together. I think I would have loved to have seen this exhibition. I mean, it must have looked really stunning. Look how elegantly he's arranged the works relative to the proportions of the space. There's such a sort of classical sense of proportion going on here. André buys, I think I managed to figure out the paperwork and pin this down, but he buys a batch of about 1,000 bricks. He acquires them from a yard, big factory in Long Island City. And they are a very unusual type of brick. They are sand lime bricks. And a lot of New York is built out of white sand lime bricks. You see it Midtown a lot. It's all over the place. And he lays them out on this new parquet floor. And there were some other works in the back room, but this was the main thing. The main show. There's just such an elegant coherence to it, and it must have, you know, to walk among these sculptures is quite an experience. We had an opportunity to do that at the Dear Beacon show a few years ago in 2014, and it is a very unusual sculptural experience to be a spectator or a viewer and to stand in the middle of the room and to see this work kind of spreading out on all sides around you at the height of your ankles. That's kind of quite amazing, really.
Yeah, I mean, Doug, do you remember, it might have been this show that made a great impression, same with you, Alistair, on Richard Serra, who it was a revelation to Richard, who just returned from Europe. And how would you describe when Richard's famous response to card were somebody had to lift these things up. And Carl responded, I'm not quoting correctly, but he said that somebody has to do it. It won't be me. And that's when Richard say, well, I will try. How would you describe this very intonation? What profoundly the effect it had on Richard Serra's early thinking? I'm thinking about Richard's consequential early works like the prop piece, like House of Cards, or the corner piece, for example, was made only a few years later.
Right. So Phong, when Serra got back from Paris, while he was there, he had been drawing Brancusi.
Yes.
He was very immersed in Brancusi's work, which is a work of the vertical orientation, right? And it brings us back to, you know, Andre's praising of Brancusi after his trip to the Philadelphia Museum. What happens is he levels it. And so suddenly, you know, sculpture, having traditionally been monumental, vertical, very substantial, ends up on the floor and spread out, almost carpet-like, but not quite carpet-like. And so, you know, Serra would have seen that and would have thought, well, you know, what's going on here? And I suspect, and Alistair, you know, we tend to see things through the lens of history and glorify them in our mind because they have acquired a certain gravitas through time. But at the moment, and probably the average viewer going through the show, if they even went to Tibor at that time, would have been puzzled and perplexed and baffled, and probably would have said, what the hell are these things? You know, they lack any kind of representation. They lack any kind of emotion. They seem to negate the very notion of what sculpture had always been. Therein lies their radicality. And Serra took that and ran with it in his own way. I mean, obviously they were all thinking about modularity, units, ready-made materials in different ways. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, like Thibaut Denage in those years had a stable of very different artists. I mean, the aesthetic was not a minimalist aesthetic at all. So Andre must have really stood out. You're absolutely right there. But this show must have attracted the attention of some people and got them very excited. I mean, David Borden, who has really quite diverse tastes, writes this piece in Art Forum in the summer of '66 and makes a lot of this work. And I think the article is called The Raised Sights of Carl Andre. And that piece really kind of consolidated his reputation. He then has an identity in Art Forum, which counts for a lot in those days.
Sure.
It's super true. And by the way, the Philadelphia trip that both Alistair and Doug are referring to is really significantly Pacific, namely the Arensberg collection. Yeah, so I did think about that context, you know, and I thought maybe we'll show the next two installation shot, Carl, just following up similarly, because within 4 years, which is remarkable, it's really baffled me, Alistair. And 4 years from that show that we just showed, that he had his show, big show at the Guggenheim. You know, so we have two shots here. Can you go back to the first, for example? Look at it. Yeah. So that's the famous, 70s pieces of work there. I want to show these two images before we go to the recent show. Particularly, I asked, I think it was Michelle Gilbert Klein and I who interviewed Carl at his apartment in the Village for the show and also anticipation as well as your big monograph there, Alistair. He was asked to tell Anne, if you had the miraculous power, you know, I mean, what would be the most memorable among your show? And he say it would be his 1970 show, the Guggenheim, because partly he said that he considered Frank Lloyd Wright building as a work of art, which is, I never heard that before. I think all the artists we know, painters, sculpture alike, always hated shown there because they had to compete with the rotunda particularly, But in Carl's case, he loved it, he thought it was great. The reason why he loved it so much, if he can send people back, transport them to that show, and the reason why he loved it so much is because when he or the viewer stood in the middle on top of the 37 piece of work, then looking up at the museum rotunda, they saw nothing. They saw just a spiral, They don't see any work of his. So Carl then make this sort of similar condition to that of Bob Ryman, whose work he admired, the almost invisible painting, so to speak. The work that doesn't pass to the viewer for attention whatsoever that I mentioned early before, So this brings to the next question. We talk about Reinhardt a bit there, but what about Cage, John Cage? I think somewhere he has to play a huge part of it. Am I right, Alistair?
I don't know, Phong. I don't know. I'm a big fan of Cage, obviously, but yeah. I'm not sure that there's any kind of genetic connection that I'm able to identify. But maybe Doug, you can see some sort of synergies.
Well, I would say that if there's a Cagean conceit, that it would have to do with one's acknowledgement of the context and environment into which one's art goes. So Cage would probably be intrigued that someone standing on the carpet wouldn't see the work, right, and see something else that would impact their perception of the world around them. So when the world intervenes, that's very Cagean and deflects something that would otherwise be sacrosanct and focused.
Right. Okay. Well, that sounds fair. I remember, I just want to squeeze this one in there just for a minute, because just following what relationship that Carl had with Richard Serra, Carl also told me in the same question about Richard Serra that he said to Richard, you put matter at risk and I put matter at rest. I thought that was such a haiku thing to say, and my response was that Richard is about verbs, where Carl is more interested in nouns and adjectives, which he's agreed a little bit there. But so now let's see the next few. I think we have two images of Carl's first show at Polar in 1980, his first show at Polar. What do you remember this, Doug? I know that you saw this show. Am I right?
No, I hadn't yet gotten to New York yet, Phong.
Okay.
So I didn't see this. I arrived in 82. Alistair, do you have any recollections of this?
Well, in 1980, I was 4 years old. So not personally, and living in another continent. But it's a lovely show to see photographs of, because this is representative of the beginning of a very fruitful relationship between Paula Cooper Gallery and Carl Andre, which has persisted right through to today. And that's really quite remarkable in this fast-moving world, that we that level of continuity is there. This is a moment in Andre's career when he's using timber a lot. He's had a show in the Netherlands in 1978 called Wood, which just focused on the wood pieces, on the timber works, and he's making some pretty large timber-based pieces at the moment. So what you're seeing on the screen on the left-hand side, I think, is a piece called Shiloh. And then on the right-hand side, a piece where the spacing is slightly different and the number of components is different as well, and that's called Fallen Timbers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of those were made in 1980. I may be incorrect there. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a piece made out of Quincy granite. And that work had just come from an exhibition in Boston at the Institute of Contemporary Art, which it just had. And all of the works in Boston had allusions to his home city of Quincy, just outside Boston. So this piece is called Manet, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. Manet means it remains in Latin, and it's an allusion to the granite legacies of quarrying granite in the city of Quincy.
How would you describe the coarse use of molecular form that is so different from other people that we know? How do you describe that, and what does that mean in the context of in place of the space, very specifically?
Yeah, he's very sensitive to what the space is and what it offers, and in that context would position the units accordingly. What's always curious to me is he'd be the first to say that it's not about anything other than what it is, and one has to be careful not to anthropomorphize and humanize the elements. And yet, to see these sentinel-like forms, like soldiers, positioned upright and rigid, it's almost impossible not to do that. But therein lies the contradiction and tension, right, in an interesting way between what the work is and what we perceive it to be. Right.
We have another view of this here, Carl. Here's the other view from the other side. So go ahead.
Sorry, Phong, that work on the far left of your screen, I think that's Sum 13 from 1978. And that would have complemented Manet on the other side. So there's a sort of formal relationship in terms of their stepped edges, which would have looked really sharp, I think.
Right. How would you describe the sense of scale? Because Doug warned us not to associate with any kind of figural or, any related to the body. Nevertheless, you can't help. Even this recent show, it's very disorienting to look down, but there's a relationship to the body nevertheless, whether to your knee or ankle, or maybe your torso. In this sense, maybe close beyond your probably hips. I don't know, but how does that relate to the physicality of the space and the body in the space, in the specific place? Is that a fair question to ask? Because I often feel that every time you go back, as I did, to the second space, the situation changes.
Yeah, no, I think, Phong, it's a really interesting question. And I've always been fascinated by that relationship between an artist and their work in terms of, and particularly if they're a sculptor, how do you measure yourself against your materials? And a lot of it's a physical rapport with the materials. So you tackle things that are of a certain size and scale, unless you're fabricating it out to somebody who will do it for you, and you can think as big as you want to. But if you're actually working on things yourself, which may not have been the case here even, but that relationship, I think, is one to think about, both how it's made and by whom, and then in what space it occupies, or what space it comes to occupy, because it changes that dynamic between the viewer and the piece.
Great, Carl. why don't we just move to the recent show right now, if we can? Yeah, it's surprisingly, it's very incredibly intimate, even though the material have a certain resistance towards any kind of seductive quality, you know, except its own material, you know, I would say present. But it was intimate, but the longer you stay, I realize how it has its own monumental sense of scale. It's no longer the body. So I noticed that the second time I came back and look at them, which bring up to Carr's own political Marxist view. I think it's been written about quite, you know, fairly by many people, I'm sure. But the issue of the distribution of labor, for example, the issue of exchange value, for example, how a piece of steel made somewhere in Pennsylvania or Long Island, or brick, as you mentioned earlier, Alistair, turn into a work of art that in turn generate a surplus value. Would this be seen as a conversation about commodity exchange and value relationship? Because I know it's very consistent, that political view on the material. Alistair?
Okay, well, yeah, this is the big narrative that Andre develops in the late 60s, and he's very articulate about this in the 1970s in his statements, and it's the big issue, the underlying issue, really, because at one level he's buying wholesale from suppliers, and he's selling at retail prices to a customer class, and so it looks very kind of commercial and opportunistic, and yet he's motivated by an entirely different agenda, which is inspired very much by the potentiality of what these materials are, and that becomes very, very important for him. So we're not going to think about how much they cost or anything like that. We're just going to think instead about what these materials could be, or what could be done with these resources. So his concept of matter is very much motivated by kind of their rawness, not in terms of like unfinished state, but in terms of what they could become or what you could make them do. So the bricks are not spoiled by adding mortar or anything like that. Mm-hmm. They're not joined together. You could potentially reuse them. The steel plates are left as modules, as sort of resources. And this piece on the far right of your screen, these are aluminum ingots. So you know, my laptop's made out of one of those. But my laptop has been turned into a kind of commodity with a logo on it, whereas Andre's ingots are left in their raw state. So that then becomes the kind of narrative which enables him to say that he's a matterist, and that he's kind of interested in the potential of production and of making things, which becomes a narrative that replaces the reality of what's going on, which is the sale of finished goods as artwork.
Thank you, Alistair. That's clear.
Thanks, Alistair. In a word, I think we're talking about contradiction, and it's a really interesting and important part of Andre's sensibility. You know, I think about what he was or who he was when he went on that pilgrimage to the Philadelphia Museum with Frampton, and Duchamp felt like such a heroic figure at that moment. And I think about both of them as poets at that moment, and particularly Andre, who wasn't making sculpture per se. He was more of a poet, and poetry is very different from objects. And so, although it can be concrete in some ways, but maybe what we're talking about is the nature of ideas and how ideas evolve into form, and how form becomes part of a cultural market and matrix. Andre, the idea of commodity, Phong, it's very complicated, and early on, I don't think any of them, that is their small circle of kindred souls, were thinking about that per se. They were just trying to survive. What was important were ideas.
Yeah.
And those ideas could be incredibly ephemeral, in the form of a happening, in the form of a tour, in the form of a poem on paper, in the form of something written, an inchoate idea. As you move through time, that begins to change, and the ideas assume different forms. And so what we've got here is the kind of fruition of that process. Duchamp was the hero who was, by the early 70s, dismissed by Andre. The ready-made was a fetish, something that was marketed and was a pure commodity, less than an idea. But Andre would also be the first to say that there's contradiction in everything. And to recognize that is to recognize the Janus nature of humankind. So whatever you say, there's an inherent contradiction. And Reinhardt would agree. And to be able to see the dual nature of things. So on the one hand, it's a pure idea. On the other hand, you sell it. And it enters this market naturally, inevitably. So where does that leave us? I don't know, with a question.
No, but I remember the show that Rob Strode did at Swanner of Reinhardt, where it's the first time that we saw his cartoon being shown, not together, but in one show, separate space, obviously, along with the famous slides that he would show to his student when he was teaching at Brooklyn College. And that was so interesting. I don't know whether he would have showed those cartoons when he was showing his painting, knowing that it would have been lessen the importance of the painting, maybe, perhaps. But in any rate, can we go directly, Douglas talking about the importance of Andre being the poet? Let's just go, we'll go back to the work. But I'd like to sort of think about this context a little bit there. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. So this was an essay on sculpture, and it was typed up on paper in 1964. It was subsequently dedicated to E.C. Goosen, who was a critic who understood artists as well as anyone did, including Barbara Rose. It talks about sculpture through language, through letters that create shape and form. And if you look at the sawtooth and the negative spaces, you can think of Brancusi's endless column. There are certain associations naturally that come to mind. But if you focus on the words themselves, and each letter is its own modular unit, and in a way, it deflects meaning, but in other ways, we naturally read them as language and in sequence. And so if you do that, you'll see that he's describing sculpture in very interesting ways, as nouns, as concepts. And this is as he was getting into making objects. So I find this to be a revelatory, portal into his thinking at a really pivotal point in time. And for the anthology of sculptors' writings that is coming out soon for the Documents of 20th Century Art, I included this as the document for Andre.
Yes, E.C. Goodson also wrote an excellent book on Stuart Davis for George Brazil, series of American art. Anything to add here, Alistair?
No, let's keep moving, shall we?
Yeah, here's another one.
Yeah, this is great to see. Yeah.
We were talking yesterday about the difference between the typewriter and the hand.
Yes.
And that they're very different. The dynamics of each is very interesting. Mechanistic versus organic in a way.
Absolutely.
But Doug, you mentioned yesterday the importance of the graph paper as the matrix, which is present in these works. So the alignment of the words and the spacing out of the letters is really not how you would normally write by hand. It's quite interesting. It's quite hybrid.
Absolutely. So, Alistair, I think of the graph paper as the base plane for the projection of imagination. So whatever letters are laid out, that the graph paper creates the parameters around and through which language is determined. And it's a really interesting discipline. It's like saying to yourself, okay, with an ensemble, we're going to play for 5 minutes and we're going to create a series of modular musical elements, but each time it's a 5-minute duration. So you're giving yourself parameters within which to create, which is really interesting.
Terrific. Can we go to also to some, here's a great one.
Yeah, so some of the names on this work are place names in Boston Harbor or around the coast around Boston. So it's alluding to Andre's place of birth again, which is a constant reference point in his art.
It's really important to him, isn't it, Alistair, that I mean, he came from a working class family and parents who had an appreciation for poetry as well. And those roots remain with him. And in a way, it feels to me like he always wants to honor that, as obtuse and ambiguous as it might be.
Very definitely, yeah.
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 I see a lot of flavor in these pieces, you all. And Tatlin for sure. Amazing. Carl, move it along because we might want it to open up in 5-10 minutes. Yeah, what strikes me about this show, Alistair, is the most simplicity of material being deployed. These are limestone. For example, can we see the next one, Carl? And then you hear the hot rolled steel plate, for example. And here's another copper 3 units. So there's a very subtle difference, but to me, that's a lot to see in the orbit of his alphabetical or, I guess, orchestrated use of material. I mean, it's a very complex show, and yet it's so quiet. I mean, this is lintel piece here, granite, and then we can move a little bit. Next piece, for example, classic red sandstone.
Can I say something about materials, Phong?
Yeah, please.
Carl has been very good throughout his life at selecting materials which have sort of regional importance. So this work, Isohedron from 1998, this was made for a very beautiful gallery, Inverleith House in Edinburgh Botanic Gardens. was a very beautiful show. And there is a type of red sandstone which is dominant in the city of Edinburgh, which you perhaps wouldn't be tuned into immediately if you were just a tourist. But Carl picked up on it, and he commissioned these blocks to be cut for him from a quarry in a place called Shotts, which is in the centre of lowlands of Scotland. And I think that sort of attentiveness to material histories is really very important. And he does that at many different shows over the course of his career.
Super true. Do we have a few more examples of the work? Here you go. It's a classic red cheddar wood.
Yeah, so the Western red cedar repeats throughout his career. It's a timber which is very resilient to the weather. It has a wonderful aroma, which is very distinctive. And I suspect the origins of this preference are the blocks which he's seeing in the shipyards in Quincy as he's growing up as a boy. So his childhood years are spent during the Second World War, when there's an enormous naval harbor in Quincy, which is manufacturing a lot of naval ships for the war effort in the Pacific. And so there would have been a hive of activity around where he was living. And these blocks are used all over the place in shipyards. So I think probably this modular dimension, which he returns to repeatedly, 12 inches by 12 inches by 36 inches, has something to do with those kind of childhood memories of proportions.
So true. That's a very important remark there. To the roots, I think Doug, you were right about his early exposure to poetry have stayed with him. But it's interesting too when you think about his friend Frampton, who spent so many time with Pound when Pound was sent to St. Elizabeth, during which time he was working on the cantos, only to discover to the tail end of that perpetual visit that he's not a poet. Carl, on the other hand, picked up on it and stayed, throughout his life. It's remarkable. Do we have any more images here, Carl? Yes. So this was surprising to see, and I can't wait to go to the vitrine. Any comment on this piece here?
Can we? Yeah. When I see this piece, and we were talking earlier about the cross fertilization during the early 60s and mid 60s of of various disciplines informing each other, and dance being one of those, along with music. And we shouldn't forget that Barbara Rose in her ABC also mentions Eric Satie and Varese and and minimal forms of music. This reminds me of, this could be like Steve Paxton contact dance, and there was a a form of dance that at that moment where dancers would, and it was improvised, interact with each other spontaneously and in ways that every move that they made against or with their bodies determined the next move, so that the choreography of what they did was in and always in real time. But it was about how bodies and forms lean against each other, snuggle up against each other, repel each other. So this has that quality for me.
Couldn't agree more. What about the most surprising piece is the next piece right here. The dispersion by chance operation of some sort, the scatter piece. And it was amazing that inclusion in the show for me. It had roots. I don't think he does it often, but definitely a few times during his lifetime. Am I right about this, Alistair?
Yeah, that's right, Phong. I think the first scatter piece might go right back to 66. I need to check the dates, but there's a very simple reason why it's scattered as opposed to arranged into a grid or a nice rectangular shape. And that's because when the units become really light, they don't stay together very well. They kind of wiggle about on the floor. And that's a major issue in a city like New York, where there's so much vibration and movement, just in terms of infrastructure. And so why arrange them into a sort of prissy little shape? Why not just like let them organize themselves? Let's just sort of allow them to form their own kind of arrangement and configuration. And that's kind of amazing and really nice.
Yes, definitely. Now we can go with pleasure. These, I think this might not be in the vitrine. Am I right, Carl?
No, this is in the vitrine. I'll go back to the install shots so that we can.
Yeah, let's see if we can go. Yeah, these are in vitrine. That here we are. So that's being elegantly curated, but now we can go see individual piece, if you don't mind, fairly quickly, so we can see how small they are. Yes.
Isn't that great?
It's amazing. I was hoping to put some of it in my pocket.
You know, Phong, I'm glad you didn't put it in your pocket. But remember yesterday we were talking about this idea of aging, not an idea, but creativity and aging, and that being able to work on this scale or continue to think about what he does on this scale enables him to persist in terms of his ideas. That is what he puts together himself. There's nothing riding on these either as potential models. They can be trashed if need be, you know, something very fresh about it.
Well, I mean, it's of course, you know, this we need to bring up the whole idea that he never had a studio. So these are maybe things that he can do at home. So that's the intimacy that I admire so much, and it's right. It reminds me so much of Every Man's Library. You know, the book is so small that you can put in your pocket. I love that whole series. Yeah, I think we can maybe with a few more, you know, a few more images here, Cal, and perhaps we can open up for question from the audience. Wouldn't that be nice?
Great.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you. Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you, Phong. So yeah, now we're going to turn it over to the audience. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But first, I'm going to go over to my friend Jeremy.
Hello, and thank you for being here and for this wonderful conversation. I had a question just around, I guess, well, I should go back and say in college at the Rocky Mountain College of Art in Denver, we were in the painting program. We were fortunate to have Carl come by one day for, you know, to look at work and talk to stuff. And painting students are fresh and they're young and they don't know a whole lot, you know, especially in Colorado where, you know, you don't have as much access to art. So you have this name that's really big kind of coming by, and we know that he's in the area a lot, you know. And here comes in this big guy that's gruff and he's wearing overalls, and you know, you get the sense of this very stark minimal work, and here is somebody who's just projecting a different image and holding like a vast amount of space and energy. Anyway, he was real gruff with us the whole time, which was fantastic, but always kind of getting to the point of you know, just the humanity in the work and the, you know, like, but it was kind of a, you know, being young and everything, it was kind of an odd experience or whatnot. But he had a show at Rural Gallery in Denver, and the opening was, I think, that same night, and it was with somebody named Melissa. I'm forgetting her last name, but anyway, of course, you know, as painting students and everything, you feel like this is important to go to and to show up to the gallery. And when I arrived, you know, a couple of the students were outside that, like, one of them was crying, and she was crying because she'd knocked down one of Carl's sculptures, and he'd like lost it with her. And then we look, and like right inside the door, like the door opened and it was right there, right? Like there's no getting around it. There was a line of it, and I don't remember if they were bronze or aluminum, or they thought, or go, you know, just, but they were bricks, and they were just high enough to where your eye didn't see it. But there was also this aspect of like Denver is a very sleepy town, right? It's, everything is like, nothing's confrontational to you, right? And here was this guy who had set up his sculpture right in the doorway, and people repeatedly kind of walked through the space and kick them over, and then he would lose it with them. And I guess for me, I just thought I would tell that story a little bit, because as you were talking, we're talking about conflict, and we were talking about the contrast in his work and everything. And for me, I felt like that was my first exposure to social sculpture, or the social aspects of sculpture. And it wasn't just something you looked at or something. It was like, here he was intentionally breaking that space and challenging people that were coming in. And I appreciated that. So anyway, I just thought, like, I wanted to find out, like, were there other things similar like that?
What
that
year?
Carl did?
What year was this?
That was in 2000.
2000. Okay, so the name that you mentioned, Melissa, is that his wife? Equally great artist, painter.
Melissa
Yep,
Kretschmer.
that's it, Melissa Kretschmer, who's actually in the audience. Watching us. Hi, Melissa. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, can I respond to Jeffrey's point, which I think is a very good one and really interesting, because there is this very interesting conversation that is ongoing when Carl-Andre installs his own work, between the size of the work and the location of the work and the size of the proportions of the space. And sometimes the relationship is really sympathetic and friendly, and it acknowledges the dimensions of the room and its proportions, so that it's just sort of accepting that. And we see that at the Guggenheim, I think, with 37 pieces of work.
Yeah.
I mean, it expands out just to fill the dimensions, but it acknowledges the circle, but yet it's doing something different. There's a beautiful rapport going on there. Sometimes, and these are the occasions I really like, he resists the kind of spatial opportunities that the space wants to provide. And it sounds like a mis-exhibition, which I don't know. He did that by positioning the works really awkwardly so that he interrupted the flow and movement through the space. But on other occasions, he's made really little pieces in very big rooms. There was a show at Paula Cooper's in that same year, 2000, called Small Sculptures, where he makes tiny little pieces for one of the big galleries at Paula Cooper's. And in a way, I think that's just part of this sculptural imagination, which he has and is so powerful, reacting or responding or relating to what is pre-existing in the environment.
Super true.
Anyway, thank you for indulging the long story, but so it was fantastic.
Thank you, Jeremy. Next, we will go over to Jonathan Neal. I will ask to unmute you. I'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my question. Hi, Doug. Hi, everybody. This sort of follows on the last comment. I'm very curious about some conversation about Andre's very deliberate self-fashioning, which really, in my mind, seems to take off in the early 70s, and obviously was still very much part of his personality and his shtick going into 2000, it sounds like. And I'm particularly interested in also a sort of related question, if some comment on Andre's relation to constructivism and his understanding of that as a sort of artistic movement, set of strategies, and the way that developed in the New York scene in the late 60s and into the early 1970s.
Doug, you want to take that on?
Actually, I think I would defer that to Alistair, but the constructivist overtones are interesting if they're stripped of the utopian pretensions.
Right. Alistair? What do you think?
I mean, thank you, Jonathan. Artists do develop a persona, don't they? And that is definitely the case in Andre. For Andre, that the wearing of a uniform, I mean, he does it, right? So, you know, maybe just out of convenience at one level, but there's also a sense of choice as well there. And in that regard, the uniform and the identity all kind of is of a piece. And yeah, it's important to him, that's for sure. And at various stages, it's been even more important. The constructivism is an interesting one. I mean, I think knowledge of Russian art in the early 60s was quite moderate. That all came later, that sort of the legacy of constructivism kind of registered with the Americans. It just wasn't accessible at that formative moment in the early 60s. But Andre nonetheless uses the word constructivism, and you get that from reading the 12 dialogues from 62 to 63. But he understands it as being a sort of a practice where you repeat a module consistently. So it's about a very simple assembling or a sort of a rhythm of accretion of sort of setting down one unit and then another. And he describes Frank Steller as a constructivist, but in this quite formal sense of how you build up a work through the repetition of a sort of separable action.
Yeah, you know, Alistair, I like to follow that a little bit too, and to your question, Jonathan. I remember talking to Mel Bachner in my interview with him. It was the last show before Winkomarski closed down his gallery on Broadway, you know, and he told the story where he and Smithson ran into Art Reinhardt, you know, whom both of them had immense respect for. And at some point they were talking, and Reinhardt said, you know, someday every artist among you guys have to choose between Malevich and Duchamp. And basically they kind of look at each other and shrug their shoulders and then say, why choose? Why choose one the other? I think so. I think Andre might be falling into that third category that Barbara may have mentioned in ABC art. You know, it's not just either you are one camp of Duchamp or you the other with Malevich. I think you can somehow mediate between the two. And I think that's very interesting why someone like Reinhardt began to do similarly, so deliberately, but were never able to allow the three simultaneous practice to be simultaneously shown or known. He kept it rather quiet. But I don't think that was the case with Andre. Does that answer your question, Jonathan? I mean, he's shown his poem alongside his sculpture from the pretty much from the beginning. Some point he even quit writing poem, I remember. I don't remember the date, but maybe sometime in, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, Alistair, but he quit writing poetry for a while.
Right, but then I think probably it wasn't a deliberate decision. I think he just got very busy in the sort of late 70s with all the activity around his sculpture. But there are poems from the 1990s, if I'm correct, and there are other small little kind of paper-based, word-based activities much later than that. So yes, essentially the poems date from the 60s and 70s.
Right.
You know, Phong, if you know, on this issue of what's important to someone at any given time, if you think about what Reinhardt said to them, and you think about his cartoons, whatever purity he had in the black paintings, the parallel universe were the cartoons. So, you know, he himself straddled. It was a question of what he would show and what he would choose to show and what he hoped people would know about him. And with Andre too, I don't know the full history of the poetry in terms of who was reading it, what was published, what was out there given the work. But to look at it now today, I mean, the two are brother and sister, you know.
Yeah, it's so true. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Jonathan. Next, we will go over to Joseph Fife. I'm asked to unmute you.
Hi there. I actually wrote the question in the chat, but the question also had to do with poetry. A number of years ago, I was reviewing cuts for a magazine which had just come out, and I always loved his poetry as well as his work, you know. And the thing I noticed studying the poetry is how often themes from American history came up. I'm relying on my memory here. I remember there was one about Lindbergh, and at the time, as far as recent poetry went, which I think sometime in the early 2000s, there was an edition published, I think by Paula Cooper, that was, you know, a poem, but it was a long narrative about a shooting in Texas based on a historical incident. And those are the two examples I can think of, but I remember there was more, how often he returned to American history in his poetry. I thought maybe you'd illuminate on this a bit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That I think you're referring to Shooting a Script from 1992. Is that right? Well, Carl Andre seems to be interested in a remarkably large number of bits of history. That would probably be the quickest answer to that. There is this amazing early poem which absorbed about 6 to 8 months of my life, I think, called America Drill from the early 60s, which is made up from different bits of American history, as you say, and he weaves it together into this very dense sort of textual form, all according to this kind of very arbitrary sort of rule-based system. But as you kind of unpiece it, you realize that it's a very, very serious attempt to kind of get to the bottom of US history and experience. So yeah, there's a lot of subject matter in the poems in a way that isn't so immediately apparent in the sculptures. That's definitely true.
And I would add also, Joe, I think he's also have a deep interest in American transcendental tradition. You know, Emerson definitely, because he's often talked about self-reliance, and I know I read that in his interview with many conversations he had with Barbara Rose. So I definitely think that he's aware of that tradition. Certainly not just Emerson, but Thoreau. I think that maybe civil disobedience might have something to do with that. That kind of, I wouldn't call it passive, the work, you know, it's very Gandhi-like in a way, in their own, you know, quiet resistance as a political gesture. So it's not Cajun. You're right though. And you're right too, Alistair, about that reference. I just thought I put it out there.
Can I make one other observation while I'm online here?
Sure.
One of the things that I've admired about his work so much is that, and I think it's kind of unique, that I actually interpret that work as being this kind of trinity between the people that actually make the materials that make his work and the artist and the audience. And he really seems to try and keep that in a kind of equilibrium. So I don't really think of the materials he uses as having potentiality. I think of the fact that because there's a kind of detachment, you know, on the part of the artist from the forming of the materials to a certain extent, you can't help but bring the workers who, you know, work with the material before they come to the actual work of art into the equation. You know, it's not something that really happens in other artists that come under the minimalist heading, I don't think. I think he's unique that way.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right.
This was great.
Thank you, Joseph. Next, we are going to hand the mic over to our friend G.E. Shorts. I'm going to ask to unmute you.
Thank you so much. But I've always come to his work as sort of a feeling of science too, because of measurement and size, proportion, scale, and all these kind of things. So I was thinking about his role in tradition. It's sort of analogous to in science, we have this principle that you know, any theory succeeds another theory, but that it must sort of still preserve the previous theory. So Einstein doesn't overthrow Newton. Newton's theory becomes smaller, a more specialized theory within Einstein's great theory of relativity. So can we say too that like Brancusi is not diminished because of Andre's work? Again, I'm asking this idea of tradition, because in fact, Andre's work preserves the interest that we have, or at least should have, in Brancusi?
Doug, you've been working on sculptural traditions.
2 words, emphatically, yes. The respect is there, and it remains in the work. It may be flattened out, it's still there.
Yeah. Well, that's haiku answer, Doug. Terrific.
Thank you, GE. And for our last question, I'm going to hand the mic over to Clarence. Clarence, I'm asking to unmute you.
Thank you for everyone. It's been a really very, sorry, my dog is going crazy. I just wondered about Andre and film. Certainly the relationship with Frampton, but I'm not aware of any, and Sarah's films, Anna Mendieta and the role of film in her work, and, you know, so many others. I don't, to the best of my knowledge, know of any films that Andre ever made. And I'm curious if he did, and wondering also if he didn't make films, if he ever seemed interested in the filmic. And, you know, I'll stop there, so.
Alistair?
I'm not aware of any films which Carl Andre has made. He's interested in photography, But he's also, you know, he's really not very fond of technology, I think. I think that's a sort of defining kind of theme in his life. I mean, the typewriter is about as sophisticated as he's got, really, in terms of using equipment. And I think the overarching love of his is just this experience of handling things and of piecing things together and lifting and hefting and feeling the weight of something. And while I'm sure he spent a lot of the 60s watching avant-garde films, like the rest of the downtown New York art world, I'm not aware that he ever tried his hand himself.
Yeah, and I should add that also, Clarence, that it wasn't so much that those people who would turn up seeing those remarkable early films, whether, you know, kind of Frampton, whether Frampton or Joseph Cornell, there's definitely remarkable film by Stan Brakhage and Michael Snow, who I mentioned, but there was a surrounding community that were created through the publication that Jonas Maker put together as early 1954, Film Culture, and then Cinema Tech and Filmmaker Cooperative. So it would rotate from place to place. One point in the late 60s was in Pace University, where he had his film theater that he rented for a good 2 years. Everyone went to see those remarkable early film. So it's, you know, it was very small, and not to mention the cross-pollination with Fluxus community. That was very important to mention, happening Capro into performances and film community. It's all there together. But you're right about Richard. Early Richard Serra's film is essential to the way he thinks, leading to his famous verb list. In fact, we had a Richard Serra film retrospective anthology just before the pandemic. It was an amazing event. It really is. But that's what we're trying to do here. You know, at the Rare, we're trying to recreate all of that cross-pollination, but do it and apply to our time now, so younger artists, students would have a chance to know that we are recreating with our nostalgia. It had to be very natural. So all of this is part of that history, you know. Thank you for your question. Back to you, Kyle.
All right. Thank you, Clarence, and thank you for all the questions today. It's been a really, really lively, interesting conversation. Can't wait to see the show once more. But at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending all of our community events with a poetry reading, and I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Ari Lisner, to the stage. Poet, journalist, and researcher Ari Lisner is based in Brooklyn. Their work has lovingly been described as the Bushwick Edward Hopper, and less lovingly as incel core. They describe it as capturing queer living, intimacy, and culture against the backdrop of New York City. Their journalism and poetry has been featured in GQ, Allure, Love Injection, Wonder Press Shit Wonder, Peach Mag, Triangle House, and others. Over to you, Ari.
Amazing. I'm going to share my screen. I feel like it would be amazing to, I wonder if I can, for you all to see my poems, but let's, oh, it's pushing us system preferences. Let's not bother. That might be a little too complicated for today, I think. Let's see if I can get it real quick. If not, no. Looks like it's gonna force me to, oh wait, no, here we go. Excellent. Cool. I don't know how to work the room for a Zoom reading, so I'm just gonna dive right into the poems. This one is called Purpose Fantasy. I'm carrying my dry cleaning in Manhattan like a poem, not someone longing for a woman. The whole city smells like Santal 33. When I swipe my Metro card, I think to say a prayer, but really just the concept of one. I will not let someone who has never ridden run me out. My body loves breakups, my heart does not. Still, I do dream of myself there, up on the 92nd Street Y podium. Normally my poems are a little bit jokier, but I take Valentine's Day very seriously. So here's another serious one. Non-magic. I see lots of films. I let them suck away my poetry. I take all opportunity in low voice to say, hey, thanks, man, to the men who hold open the theater door. Maybe there is nothing left to see. I beg for a hard reset on Thanksgiving, stoned up to the stars at my parents' house. I might die unresolved. I swear I will make myself scarce, taking on the project of a simple sexuality, to become magnetic. A light gray hoodie will solve me. It will feel great swearing away that part of life's riddle. Give me a kiss in such a way that mitigates. Greet me sweetly when I return to bed. I have a frozen peanut butter cup for us. Odd behaviors, yawning on powdered drugs, and my clenching jaw, a panic attack in Atlantic City. I feel certain I will never see you again. You remind me we have plans on Sunday. My world spins. I could be lost in the mines or here on business, playing the long game, in all consumption. McDonald's is out of Egg McMuffins in the morning. I worry about the breaking all over again when I find out. So thankful we have met. I deify you. I want you to deify me right back. Tell me I have hot hands when I grip the steering wheel as I contend with my non-magic. Here's one more. It's a nice little compliment to the other one. You cherish the unspoken. You cherish the unspoken. I want to name it so desperately. We're two harmless monsters with different attachment styles, brain dead from the powder drugs and the Space Odyssey themed sex motel room. I make a mad dash for McDonald's before the breakfast hours end. I will not let us miss it this time. There's a need to sink our teeth into sweet, squishy, airy nothing, blanketed in processed American, and love it so. It rains cold on the drive back to the city. We listen to music that moves us from the bottom up, refusing the top down on principle. Through the Holland Tunnel, we make more plans. It's always a sexy little weekend with us. In Manhattan, the need for greens is mutually felt, so we cave for a chic lunch where you do all the ordering. Stewed vegetables, 2 contrasting salads, a bright tzatziki. I slump low, but reach out to touch the tips of your fingers. In a few hours, you will get cut from work and I will drive back into the city from Brooklyn with time before the film begins. It will be us in the warm Veselka light. It's as simple as that. 2 people and 1 slice of carrot cake. And then I just have one tiny little one in honor of Valentine's Day. This is something I wrote last year, hoping this Valentine's Day will be a little better. Valentine's Day. My Velcro keeps sticking to your nice coat. I'm cursing there, stuck to you. Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Thank you so much, Ari. That was really, really fantastic. And thank you, Doug and Alistair and Phong. And we'd also like to thank Paula, Lucas, Anthony, Robbie, Daisy, everyone at Paula Cooper for helping make this event possible and for sponsoring it. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we'll upload today's conversation shortly. And please join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Dominic Chambers and Zoe Hopkins on the event of Chambers' show at Lemon Maupin. You can now turn on your microphones and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Friday. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Doug and Alistair, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ari.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Doug.
Alistair. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you,
Thank you all for
Alistair.
coming.
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you.
Alistair.
Thank you for the reading, Ari. Thank you. Good to see you
Charlie.
all.
Amazing,
Thank
Phong.
you.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy that you will tune in. And it's Friday, so I can't wait to have my lunch with my team and and a drink the end of the day. It's Friday. Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ari.
Thanks
Thank
a
you,
lot.
Doug. Thank
Have a
you,
great
you guys.
weekend, everyone.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye, you all.
Great.
Much love.
Ciao,
Hi,
Di-
Tom. Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tom. Hi, G. Bye, bye, you guys.